opening words this morning are written by Karen Johnston. As we gather this morning, let us be a people of not forgetting. Let us practice holding collective memories that might otherwise slip into that enormous void that sucks at and corrodes any future we hold dear. Let us practice honoring truth-telling up from the past that must come fully into the now, lest we falter and fail, lest the whole remain in pieces. Let not our need for comfort or simplicity, for easy forgiveness or false pardon, smother the heartbreak that still needs healing. Let us practice resilience with reckoning. Let us marry memory and promise. Let us dance in the tension we find there. Let us rest in the integrity we cultivate there. Let us be partners with the possibility that emerges there. It is good. We gather.
Good morning and welcome to the Wonder Box. I wonder what could be in our box of possibilities today. Let's see. We have 2 books. Let's pretend that these belong to Sam and Sandy, 2 children who are friends. This is Sam's book and this is Sandy's book. What happens if I rip out a page or more from Sam's book? Let's see. The book isn't complete anymore. It's damaged. Sam will be cheated from getting the whole story. That's what happens to the history of our country when we forget and erase parts of our history, because those parts were about people of color. The story is damaged. The story is incomplete. It's a story that should make us all feel cheated. Our theme this month is holding history. And our faith places truthful telling of history at the center of our principles. 2 of our principles are especially connected to the truthful telling of history. In our first principle, we promise to value the worth and dignity of every person. This principle is connected to truthful telling because every person's story and history has worth and dignity. In our fourth principle, we promise to value the search for what is true. This is connected to truthful telling because we value and seek out the stories of marginalized peoples to begin to heal racism. When we tell the real story, it's not just that we want to be honest and want to tell the full story. It's also because part of the story has been locked up. And by locking up the real story, we erase the people of color in the story, causing pain and preventing their gifts from flowing out into the world. As part of our Unitarian Universalist faith, we want to resist and defy the racism in our country that wants to keep the truthful telling hidden. We want truthful tellings so that we can find the broken places and let the beauty and healing emerge. But here's the thing. Telling the truth about history doesn't just involve telling the whole story. It also requires doing actions that repair and make up for the damage in the past. For example, the government of Canada recently announced that all fees for the name-changing process for Indigenous peoples will be waived. They don't have to pay them. Do you wonder what this means? Let me explain. All the way up until the 1980s, Indigenous children across North America were removed from their homes without their families' consent and were placed in residential schools far away from where they lived. The last of these schools closed in 1996. At these schools, the children's names were changed from their traditional names, a practice that, among many other practices, was meant to strip the children of their culture. Now, the Canadian government recognizes this and have waived the fees so that they can change their names back to their traditional names without having to pay a penalty, which many just cannot afford. This is just one small way to offer reparation or repair for harm caused by systemic racism. The thing is, you can't change systems if you don't have truthful storytelling. I wonder, what stories do we need to hear? What histories do we need to hold? And with this, our lesson is told. Until the next time.
There is a story of the first Thanksgiving that has been told in classrooms in the United States for decades. Here is one version of that story. In 1620, the Pilgrims fled religious persecution in Britain and traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to arrive at Plymouth Rock. They were unprepared to face the first harsh winter and risked freezing and starving to death. The Indians welcomed them to the new land and taught them how to plant crops. In the fall, they harvested their crops and enjoyed a feast alongside the Indians. The Pilgrims gave thanks for the bountiful harvest and for the help of the Indians. This well-known story is very far from the truth of what happened with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans in that encounter. This morning, I would like to share with you a more complicated and more accurate version of these events. In 1620, the Mayflower landed in what is now called Plymouth, which then belonged to the Patuxet and Wampanoag tribes. It was a busy corridor in those days. All along the East Coast were complicated trade routes. So the native people were not surprised when the Pilgrims landed, but they were surprised that they stayed. Foreigners had come before to trade and map and hunt. These weren't the first white people that they had seen. But until the Pilgrims, the Europeans didn't just move on in. The Wampanoag had been in that part of what is now southern Massachusetts for 12,000 years. Much of the information I'm sharing today is from This Land is Their Land by David Silverman, and from a terrific sermon preached by our denominational president, the Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray, in the worship service Thanksgiving Reframed that you can find on YouTube. In March of 1621, the Wampanoag chief and the governor of the Plymouth colony forged an agreement of mutual defense. If either was attacked, they would fight alongside their allies. It didn't mean things were warm and fuzzy between the groups. It just meant that they had a military allyship. Later that year, the colony had their first successful harvest, and the Wampanoag chief and 50 of his fellow leaders traveled to Plymouth to share a celebratory meal. The two groups had an uneasy alliance for around 50 years, until the conflict called King Philip's War broke out. In King Philip's War, the Europeans devastated the Wampanoags and left their community devastated as well. Wampanoags today remember the anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims in North America as a day of deep mourning, not as a celebration of Thanksgiving. An important thing to note about the Pilgrims is that they were the precursors to the Unitarians in New England. The Pilgrims later became known as the Congregationalists. The Congregationalists and the Unitarians then split over theology. Plenty of our New England congregations were founded by the children and grandchildren of those Mayflower Pilgrims. And a Unitarian minister, Alexander Young, played a major role in the creation of the myth of the first Thanksgiving that became so popular in the United States. Back in 1621, a pilgrim named Edward Winslow wrote in his journal 4 sentences about the Pilgrims' first successful harvest. All he said was, there was a military alliance, and then tribe members came to celebrate the harvest. 200 years later, in 1841, almost 200 years later, the Unitarian minister Reverend Alexander Young discovered that journal. He took that account and he spun a story about pilgrims and Indians breaking bread, splitting a few turkeys, and getting along just great. It was a big creative stretch, but it caught on like wildfire in the cultural imagination of white New Englanders. Still, Thanksgiving didn't catch on as a national holiday until 1863, when after the horrific battle at Gettysburg, President Lincoln was looking for ways to unite a traumatized and divided nation. He created an official day off to give thanks for peace. This holiday became associated with the myth of the first Thanksgiving. In 1863, the descendants of Pilgrims were still stealing land from Native Americans. Native Americans lived in poverty and faced discrimination. Then, as now, Native Americans had lighter, shorter lifespans and were denied access to good public schools. The Thanksgiving story was a way for New Englanders to tell the story of the origin of the United States as a peaceful encounter. It did not include the violence of the Indian Wars. It did not address how Native Americans were decimated by diseases brought by Europeans. It did not address enslavement of Native Americans by Europeans. It did not talk about the European theft of Native American land. It enabled the European Americans who heard the story to feel good about their country's history. It erased and minimized exploitation of Native Americans. Contemporary Unitarian Universalism offers a life-giving and liberating theology that says no one is outside the circle of love. Our theology teaches that every person has inherent worth and dignity, and our beliefs call us to work for a world in which that inherent worth and dignity is affirmed and honored. But we continue to fail to live into this liberating theology because of the ways our faith has been steeped in white supremacy and colonialism. The Europeans who colonized New England believed that they were superior to the Native Americans, who they viewed as savages who needed to be saved by Christianity. Their religious beliefs justified war, theft of land, exploitation, and enslavement. These harmful beliefs continue to support the marginalization and exploitation of Native Americans, Black people, and other people of color in the United States today. They uphold unjust and oppressive systems. I want to share with you a quote from UUA President Susan Frederick Gray from her sermon in the Thanksgiving Reframed worship service. She says this: "Narratives of domination and supremacy separate us from the beauty, the love, and the fullness of the truth of our creation. Our work is both to make visible these systems and to dismantle these narratives and practices, beginning with how they live in ourselves. If we are truly to be about the work of liberation, justice, love, and compassion, then this is our work." End of quote. An important piece of this work is, the quote goes on. This is still Susan's words. "An important piece of this work is examining and debunking the Thanksgiving myth and owning our own religious tradition's role in its creation." That's the end of the quote right there. Examining the falsehoods in the story of the first Thanksgiving and telling the truth of the painful history of Europeans and Native Americans in the United States is an important part of the work of dismantling white supremacy culture in our Unitarian Universalist congregations. We need to know the truth of the history of our country and our faith tradition, to learn from it, so that we can fully realize the liberating potential of our theology. As Unitarian Universalists working to build beloved community together, I trust that we can hold the complexity of this holiday together. I trust that in wrestling with the painful parts of our history, we can learn how to better move forward together, to say yes to liberation, justice, equity, and compassion. This Thanksgiving, I am grateful that I will be able to gather with my family members in person for a bountiful Thanksgiving meal. I am grateful that my son has been vaccinated for COVID-19 and life is getting a little easier for our family. I am grateful for the many ways we are able to gather together as a community, both in person and on Zoom. It is important to take time to savor the many gifts we have received this November. We can be grateful for the gifts we have received living in the United States, even as we honor and acknowledge the truth of the painful history in this country. I am grateful for those who are dismantling white supremacy in our congregation, our denomination, and our world. I am grateful for complexity, that I can rejoice in the many blessings of my life without erasing the history of this country. I am grateful for the opportunity to work together with you to help make this world a better place for future generations. Again and again, I am so grateful for this community. I want to close the sermon this morning by returning to words that I shared for our opening, written by Karen Johnston. Let not our need for comfort or simplicity, for easy forgiveness or false pardon, smother the heartbreak that still needs healing. Let us practice resilience with reckoning. Let us marry memory and promise. Let us dance in the tension we find there. Let us rest in the integrity we cultivate there. Let us be partners with the possibility that emerges there. May it be so.